So Troy was located, show me the World of the Mycenaean Giants map. I think that's where we'll see it. There, you can see it, Troy. It was in the Troad, that is, the region below the Dardanelles Strait. This is the site of the hill of Izarlik, where the city of Troy was found and identified, and where nobody doubts any longer that Troy was there. The question that historians may still be asking is, but did the Trojan War have... Well, there's no reason to think that the Trojan War didn't happen, as long as I've explained that older evidence, archaeology, heroic myths. There's no reason to think it didn't happen, especially as there are plenty of clues to show that it did happen, and we're increasingly sure that it did. Because you have, and this is extremely interesting, you have a third source, which are the texts of the Hittites. The Hittites ruled Anatolia, the civilization that ruled Anatolia, from its capital Attusa, which I'll talk about in a moment. And around the year of the year in Hittite texts, we have in the couriers, since we have traces of correspondence, if you like, diplomatic, which were archived by the kings. There is an armed confrontation between a certain Atasia, who would have been a man of the Ayawas, who is said to have driven out of his land of then called Vilusa, an individual called Maduata, who was a vassal of the Hittites. And so for archaeologists, it's more and more likely that the kingdom of Ayawa, in Hittite texts, was the Achaean nation, the Achaeans in Homer. So it would have been a distortion, but that's often how we manage to identify, i.e. by name proximities, the only people in the area who can be identified with Ayawa. And what's more, geographically it makes sense. It would be the people who ruled over Iga at the time, i.e. the Achaeans. And what's more, the name fits, so no problem, it's very likely. And Wilusa or Vilusa, i.e. it's spelled with a W, so I think it would be pronounced Wilusa. We think it would be the Hittite transposition of Archaic Greek, or the equivalent in any case of Archaic Greek Wilios, which became Ilios in classical Greece. That must mean something to you. Ilios is Ilion, which gave rise to the Iliad, and Ilion is 3. So it's the city of Troy. So in fact, if you look at it, it means you'd have this Atasia, a man of the Achaeans, who would have driven out of his land of Troy an individual called Maduata, who was a vassal of the Hittites, i.e. Troy was a vassal city of the Hittites, which was a great territorial empire, and would have been attacked at that time by the Achaeans. And this Atasia, who is called Atasia, the leader of the Achaeans, must remind you of Atreus. In Greek, Atreus, who was Eurystheus' successor on the throne of Mycenae. Let me remind you that Heracles was an agent of Eurystheus, and in Greek heroic myths, Heracles is said to have been the first to attack the city of Troy. So very clearly you had Atre, king of Mycenae, who committed the first Trojan War, presumably with Heracles as his general-in-chief, to attack the Hittite power. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it for a second, because this Mycenaean power, which has established itself against Thebes, which has just conquered Pylos, finally continues its expansion beyond the sea and attacks the city of Troy for the first time. If you like, it all makes absolute sense at this point in time. Makes absolute sense. From the moment Troy was a Hittite balcony on the Aegean Sea, it was dangerous for the Mycenaean expansion drive, which was probably beginning to expand too. Since the same Heracles had intervened in Crete, the Achaeans' ambition at the time was to seize the entire port of the Aegean Sea, and so they had to clear the Hittite from the north. And so to the north there was this city of Troy, which was powerful. So that was the first conflict, and what's very interesting if you look at ancient authors, and Herodotus in particular, is that for Herodotus the main Trojan War took place a century after the adventures of Heracles. So it's likely that, and I mean, if you didn't have the Greek heroic myths, you could be pretty sure that given that the Mycenaeans were probably powerful enough to conquer Crete, and that on the other side in Anatolia you had the Hittites who were powerful, you'd say that the guys would fight on the Aegean coast. There's no problem. It's obvious it's a frontier between two powers, so they'd fight there. But except that the texts, and moreover the heroic myths, tell you about it. So apart from the fact that you would have known, if you just had the demographic and archaeological elements, that people would probably have fought there, thanks to what I told you earlier. Thanks to the texts, you have a plot, so you know more or less in what order it happens. So, there was probably in fact a series of wars over several decades between Hittite space and Achaean space. A diplomatic document found in the Hittite capital, Atusa, refers to a confrontation that took place around 1280 BC. So, a century after the attack on Atarsaya, Intre, therefore in the time of Heracles, and so this chronology fits with that of Herodotus once again, and so we found at that date a treaty between the Hittite Empire and Alexander, king of Wilusa, and in the Trojan War, Paris is also called Alexander, son of the Trojan king Priam. So we understand that once again the Hittites were allies of Troy at the time and were trying to defend it against the attack of the Mycenaeans. Another Hittite document from Tawagalawa was addressed by a Hittite ruler, probably Atusili III, to the great king of Ahiawa, the Wanaka, the Anaxanthrope, i.e. Agamemnon, probably at that time. So the Hittite document doesn't name him, but what's important is that great king in Hittite language means the admission of a status equivalent to that of the king of the Hittites, who himself had a status equivalent to that of the Egyptian pharaoh. So it means that the chief of the Mycenaeans, the chief of the Achaeans, was in the very closed club of sovereigns, in fact of the supreme of the civilizations of that era. And Atusili in particular talks to this great king about Wiusa, i.e. Troy, and asks him to extradite a person called Piamaradu, who is considered a troublemaker. And what's very interesting is that this Piamaradu is close to Priam, also king of Troy. So it's likely that guys have always revolved around 2 or 3 names, as is often the case in these civilizations. I think it's Latin. If you take Latin, there were 3 or 5 or 6 male first names, I think. In Latin, it was really, you have Gnaeus, Caius, etc. It's pretty much always the same. The same goes for Carthaginian names. Everyone is called Anon, Hannibal, or Magon in Carthaginian history. So it's probably not surprising that we find names that are culturally marked and show that we're really talking about that place. Having said that, it's possible that the Homeric tradition mixed up the names, calling the father Priam and the son Alexandu instead of the other way around. But that's not important. Once again, it's not the detail that's important, it's the plot. But then, so what we know for sure is that this Trojan War probably took place and that it was won by the Mycenaeans, but we don't know that for sure archaeologically. We know that it was destroyed, but in fact we have no trace of Hayawa afterwards in the tidal eyebrows. So it's not the departmental archives either. The tidal eyebrows, of course we have holes, we found what we found. But what you also need to know is that in any case, after 9,250, the Hittite Empire collapsed completely in the decades that followed. So maybe they had too much to do than write about the neighbors. And it disappears completely around 9,200 BC, the Hittite Empire. And Tuza, so the capital of the Hittite Empire, is destroyed at that time. So this too is extremely interesting, and you'll have to come to it because look, so this is what we estimate to be around 1300 BC, so a century or so, or around the time of the First Trojan War. And then if you look again at the following map around 1200 BC, you see the Hittite Empire, you see the Egyptian Empire, you have the extension of the Mycenaeans, which we know from archaeology to be reliable. We'll come back to this later when I present my own thesis on what happened next for the Mycenaeans, because in reality, from that point onwards, things are blurred. Archaeologically, we're beginning to see destruction appearing all over the Mediterranean. And what we do know, and this is something I've already mentioned in previous broadcasts, is that at the beginning of the 12th century BC, so around 1180, 1170, and in the decades, it's something that takes several decades, but you have a systemic collapse of civilization, meaning that you have all the great empires disappearing. In the space of 50 years, we see Egypt folding in on itself. It's the only one not to disappear completely. Well, it's really retreating, as you'll see if I show you the following map. And by the time we get to 90,000 BC, i.e. the beginning of the 11th century, the end of the 11th century, everything has disappeared. As you can see, only a few things are starting to reappear, but everything has disappeared. So It's important because it means that everything disappears, everything collapses, including the Mycenaeans, i.e. the Hittite and Egypt, which folds up in a space of 50 years. And what we also know at the time is that there was a great deal of destruction everywhere by various means, but particularly by fire, etc. So things that suggest that there were conflicts, and the archaeologists don't really know why. Well, they don't really know why, but we do know that there were probably major population movements. There's always a theory to explain just about everything in history over the last 30 years, which is probably because of climate change, because that's what's fashionable, but the truth is we don't know. What we do know is that there were major population movements, and these population movements were called, according to Egyptian texts, which mention 2 invasions that the Egyptians resisted, around GVX and XV, around GVX and XVXN, and around GVX and XVX and XV, who are a group of peoples I'm going to tell you about next, who are listed on Egyptian inscriptions, which aren't exactly the same each time, but where you can see that they come from roughly the same corners, and who, given where Egypt is located, probably came from the sea. And so the archaeologists and historians who studied these texts coined the expression peoples of the sea, meaning the people who attacked Egypt. And more broadly, it was felt that they were responsible for the foundations of all these civilizations, rather like the barbarian invasions that destroyed the Mycenaean civilizations, the Hittite civilization, and so on. The same people would have been responsible. So I've got a few images to explain all this to you. First, there's the map showing the invasions of the peoples of the sea, which is here. So this shows you the empires we knew at the time, the Mycenaeans. You see it's the same as on the other map, Greece, etc. And it shows the population movements we know about. So of course Mycenaean Greece underwent a lot of destruction at the time. This is always the difficulty when you see destruction by war. It can be civil war as well as foreign war. And if you have nothing to tell you that it was one case or the other, you're in a state of indecision. And so you see population movements in all directions, which mean that, well, we've said it's all the people of the sea, and so it's a rather incomprehensible general collapse. So the origin of the sea peoples is debated, but in fact most of those who are relatively identifiable come from Anatolia, and that's extremely important. Why? Because there have been explanations that have tried to get some of them from Sicily or something like that, but the most likely explanations are the ones that get them from Anatolia. For example, the Teresh and Weshesh that we attribute, that we try to bring closer either to Wilusa, who came from Troy, could also have come from other places a little further east. That could have been Etruscans, since you know that the Etruscans originally came from Anatolia, the Etruscans from Lydia, for example, so a little further east, but they would still be in that area. So in general, we have doubts about the exact origin, but we're pretty sure that they all come from that area. So why is this important? Because my theory is that in Anatolia, the sea was simply initially a coalition of people under Achaean, and therefore Mycenaean. Why do I say this? Because you've already got some in there. The Equeches, who are probably Achaean, it's practically transparent. There's no problem. Just about everyone agrees that's what they are. In addition, the Pelecites, who became the Philistines and invaded Canaan, were probably pillages and are designated by Egyptian sources as likely to have come from Crete. So that's already 2 sets of populations coming from places that we're sure were dominated by the Mycenaeans. Then you always have the theory that, oh yes, but as the Mycenaeans were invaded by everyone else, then they left. It was like a billiard ball and they invaded someone else. Well, for a power that had been in the throes of expansionist dynamism for 100 years, that doesn't make the most sense to me. Especially since we're here in the midst of a movement at the end of a war, which, according to the sources, well, we know that the Trojan War took place archaeologically. It's been destroyed. We have the texts I've just quoted. And in addition, we have the Greek heroic account that Troy was taken by the Achaeans. This means that the Trojan area, where these characters came from, was also dominated by the Mycenaeans. All right. I think it's extremely likely that after the Argolid triad had spread throughout Greece, that it had spread to Crete, that it had spread to Troy and continued its expansion, and that it had done so by regularly gathering under its banner auxiliaries from the coalition troops of the peoples it had conquered. This is what empires have always done, especially the Romans, and what all the great invaders did. Even if you take Attila's Huns, they did this. Among the Huns you had a core population that came from the east, and then you had Avars, Alès, etc. Inside, who were added? And so, in all likelihood, and it seems obvious to me when you look at this map, the Mycenaeans, who had been at war for over 100 years, as we've seen with the Hittites, probably formed a coalition of people who were former vassals of the Hittites, or who were either on the banks of the Hittite Empire, or who were true vassals of the Hittites, such as the Chardanes and the Denians, to attack the Hittites themselves and to raze to the ground the Hittite capital Attusa, which disappeared around 1200 BC. Because in fact, chronologically, the fall of Attusa is concomitant with, or very slightly precedes, we're not sure because we don't have an exact date, the invasion of the lame peoples against Egypt. Now, if we take this thesis, you see that it's part of a movement, i.e. the Mycenaeans continue their expansion towards their first enemies, the Hittites, and then attempt to plunder the only power that resists them and that they have never actually plundered, which is Egypt. And so you have two wars coming against the Egyptian Lamir peoples. The first takes place, as I said, around 1208 BC. So, while I'm explaining this, could you please show the following images here, ppm, of the Lamir peoples, which show you roughly what they looked like according to the descriptions we have, which include just before that, Pascal asks, can a volcanic eruption like the one at Santorini explain the collapse of one or more empires? Well, no, because Santorini, as far as we can remember and date, is 1600 and 1500 BC. So it's 300 or 400 years before the systemic collapse, so it can't be the origin of this. On the other hand, it corresponds to the time when Crete weakened enough to become relatively easy prey for the Mycenaeans. So it may indeed have weakened the Cretan situation sufficiently. The rest is probably too far away for the tidal wave to have had enough effect. I think we've only archaeologically documented what it might have done in Crete, which was on the way over when there was no, it really came in almost a straight line. So you can put all the pictures together so you can see a little bit. So here you have an Egyptian bas-relief at the bottom showing Pharaoh fighting against his invaders. Then you have reconstructions drawn for this invasion. So there were two invasions. The first, which took place under the reign of Merneptah around 2108 BC, came from Libya. That is probably from Cyrenaica, which didn't come from Tripoli, which didn't exist at the time, but from Cyrenaica. And the leader of this expedition was a certain Merire, most likely a Libyan chief, even if there were also Equatius Greeks in it. But probably, according to the casualty figures mentioned by the Egyptians, well, I'll give you the count of enemy losses during the battle in which the Egyptians repelled them. There would have been 6,000. So I won't give you I'll just give you the rough figure. There would have been around 6,000 Libyans, 200 Shekelek, 700 Terech, 2,000 Equesh, and 200 Lucas and Chardin, i.e., apart from the Libyans, the main contingent were Achaeans, and a few others who were former Hittite vassals. So it's likely that the Libyan Merir had wanted to invade Egypt and had obtained the alliance of the Mycenaeans, who assisted him in this. So that's the first attack, coming from the west towards Egypt, and the second attack arriving some 20 years later, even 30 years later, under the reign of Ramses III. This is how it is described in the inscription on the walls of the temple of Medide Tabu in Upper Egypt. Foreign countries conspired in their islands. So you see, the Egyptians, who were probably the best informed people of the time, don't talk about barbarians arriving from all sides. They say foreign countries conspired in their islands. All the countries were immediately struck down and scattered in the melee. No country had been able to stand before their arms since Hatti, thus the country of Hittite, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Al-Hashiyah. So Carchemish and Arzawa are in northern Syria, and Al-Hashiyah is Cyprus, presumably. They set up camp in a single place, the land of Amuru. So there it is again, on the side of Syria, it seems to me. All these countries were united. Their hands were on the country up to the circle of the earth. So they're saying that this coalition dominated the whole world. Their hearts were confident and assured. Our plans will succeed. So we're talking about a planned invasion. And what's really interesting is that it shows that for 20 or 30 years after destroying Atubza, the Mycenaeans ruled the whole of Anatolia as well as the Aegean and invaded the entire Near East and pushed back the Egyptians who had been there until then. So it really was a very important war. So for example, if you look at the following map, you'll see the Philistines. So what were the Philistines? As I said, they were the Pelechetis, that is to say the Pelegis, but simply people who came from Crete and then stayed for centuries. Since they were a great enemy of the kingdom of Israel for a long time, the Philistines are the great biblical enemy. Goliath was a Philistine in particular, and so you see that they settled in. So this coalition, probably led by the Mycenaeans, settled in all the way and pushed back the Egyptian power on both sides. So all I've talked about is logic. The reason why I think these sea peoples were a real coalition, not just a bunch of people wandering around invading. It was a coalition under the Mycenaean aegis to finally conquer the part of the world they hadn't yet conquered. Because once they'd conquered the entire Aegean rim, the entire Date anatomy, and descended towards the Near East, the only thing missing to dominate the entire known world at the time was Egypt. So that's just logic as I've explained it. But what's really interesting is that, once again, the Greek heroic myths confirm this whole thesis. Since if you read so every time, whether it's Solon on Atlantis or Herodotus, they all explain that they went to consult the Egyptians, because the Egyptians were the guys who kept the archives, precisely because their empire suffered during this systemic collapse, which in fact, as we'll see, was simply what happened at the end of the Mycenaean Empire, like the collapse of the Roman Empire. They suffered, but their cities were not destroyed, and Egyptian civilization survived despite a period of retreat. So their archives were not destroyed. So Herodotus explains that he went to the Greeks for information, and that the Egyptian priests, when he asked them about the Trojan War, do you have anything to say about it? But at the same time, he was said to have ransacked the country and then fled to Libya. Interesting, eh? That explains why Menelaus, after the Trojan War, went to attack and pillage Egypt. What's important is that this victorious warlord then went on to Egypt and then Libya. This means that the idea of an attack on Egypt by the leading Mycenaean leader, and that we see a link with Libya, which we've seen was the first source of the attack on Egypt. And in the Odyssey, in books 3 and 4, and in the Greek poet Apollodorus, so another source than Herodotus, we also find elements about Menelaus' journey, which in literature is called Menelaus' Wanderings. And the idea, the story, is that after victory in the Trojan War, Agamemnon remains with half the Athenian army in Troy, and Menelaus leaves with the other half of the army, venturing off to Libya, in Egypt, in Cyprus, in Phoenicia, in Sidon, so in Phoenicia, among the Erimbes, so we don't know what they are, maybe Arabs, and he would have gone as far as Ethiopia. And so, with the exception of Ethiopia, even if we don't really know if it meant what we call Ethiopia today, but it would be in the south of Egypt, what does that mean? It means that two other sources, Homer's Odyssey and Apollodorus, take you to all the places visited by the peoples of the sea. Egyptian texts from Ramses III to Medinadabau tell you that the sea peoples took over these places. You've got Greek accounts explaining that Menelaus went to all those places at the head of the Achaean army. That's all we need. We've got a text explaining it. And it's not the only text we have, because I'm going to read you the whole quotation. It's a short page long. You'll see it's interesting. It's in the 14th field of the Odyssey, the story of Ulysses. I'll read it to you. When I got there, I ordered my faithful companions to stay with their ship and guard the vessels, and I sent observers to the highest points. My people then, giving in to their violence and being guided by their envy, immediately set about ravaging the country ways of this people of Egypt, taking the women and grandchildren to slaughter the men. The cry of battle quickly reached the city. The Egyptians, stretching out their clamours, arrived just as dawn was breaking, the whole plain filled with foot soldiers, chariot drivers, and the flashes of bronze. Zeus, the thunderbolt thrower, unleashed a fatal panic on our legs. No one dared stand and face it, for misfortune was forcing its way in from all sides. The Egyptians then killed a number of our people with the sharp bronze, and took them alive to force them to work for them. Immediately I stripped my head of its well-made helmet, removed the shield I had on my shoulders, and my hand threw his spear away from me. Then, advancing straight towards the king's horses, I seized his knees and kissed them. He protected me and took pity on me. Then, having seated me on his chariot, he led me bathed in tears to his palace. To tell the truth, crowds of his subjects hurled themselves at me with their ash spears, burning to kill me, for their fury was at its height. So I find this quite extraordinary, because it means that in Homer's Odyssey you have a text that is the Greek point of view of what we find in the Medinet Tabu text of Ramses III, who explains that he kicked Homer's people out. So I'm very surprised, because I don't think anyone is shocked by this, because I haven't found any articles. So I have the impression that archaeologists often don't listen to Greek mythology. It doesn't interest them. But for me, as a historian, you have to look at this text. It's completely in line with what the Medinet Tabu texts in Egypt say. And they support my thesis that the attack on Egypt was something the Mycenaeans had calculated, and that they even kept the memory of the fiasco that it was, of the disaster, and that they even recounted it, which is quite honest. Generally speaking, it's not the kind of thing that gets turned into an epic, but we can see that in the Odyssey, after having conquered the whole of the known world, we got beaten up in Egypt. That's what the text says. So, for me, the scenario is quite clear. The first time the Egyptians try to help the Libyans invade Egypt to subdue it, they don't succeed, they're repulsed. A generation later, they need 25-30 years, they launch another attack from the other side, they totally destroy Ampiretit. On their way, they also conquer the whole Near East, and they wrest the Near East from the Egyptians, and simply then, when they really try to attack Egypt itself, there they get pushed back. So for me, there's no doubt that the right map, if you like, of Mycenaean domination is this. So it brings together the ancient Minoan space. I think there were still contacts, and we've even found ceramics as far away as Sicily, and that was an era of Minoan expansion. But above all, the two red dots are the city of Troy, which I've already shown you, and the other is the Hittite capital, Attusa. So since Attusa was destroyed at the same time as the history of the Sea Peoples, etc., it's likely that it was also under Mycenaean control, which means that at least up to Attusa, the Mycenaeans extended their hold over Anatolia, and then throughout the Near East, and probably the king of Libya was their client. So this is how, in my opinion, the Mycenaean reign succeeded in making the empire of the Mycenaean be civilization, the ancestor of the Roman Empire, the ancestor of the American Empire, its maximum degree of expansion. For me, we need to go beyond what archaeology tells us. For the moment, archaeologists think that it's what's in dark blue here. That was the Mycenaean kingdom. For a long time, that's all it was. But in the last century of the Mycenaean power, there was a very important impetus, which, thanks to coalitions, enabled the Mycenaeans to briefly take control of the whole thing, i.e. within 23 years. But the bee civilization doesn't stop there. It collapses from within, as you know. So while the Mycenaean heart was solid up to that point, it was fragile, but the Mycenaean heart was solid up to that point. In fact, what happened afterwards was that he probably suffered a lot in his heart, in his internal order. So what could have happened? You know that what normally characterizes the end of a bee civilization is what I call Sovietization, i.e. the emergence of a truly central oppressive power, which destroys traditional counterpowers and powers, and in particular the traditional constitutional order, to replace it with a much more authoritarian dirigist power, and that this is what leads to collapse. And in fact, what we're seeing in the Mycenaean area is indeed a collapse. I was saying it's around the same time, but in reality, if you look at it, it's a few decades later. So things start to go wrong at the same time as the Sea Peoples, probably because internal struggles have been reawakened by the Trojan War. We can see them, rivalries between Greek chiefs in the Trojan War. But it's more in the decades that follow, around that time, that things really start to fall apart. Archaeology shows a change in the economic and political organization of societies, with the destruction of a certain number of palaces and the preservation of the main ones, i.e., probably a centralization of power, and then the Mycenaean civilization completely disappeared. So what happens in the meantime? Once again, we don't have a plot here, so we'll have to look to the Greek heroic myths to try and find one. What do the Greek heroic myths tell you? They tell you that on his return from the Trojan War, Agamemnon is murdered by his wife's lover, Hephaestus, who usurps the throne, and then it's Agamemnon's son, Orestes, who, as I said earlier, had taken refuge in Argos, who comes and kills him. So it's clear that right up until the day after the Trojan War, there was an internal struggle for central power in Mycenae. And what's interesting is that the heroic tradition explains that Orestes, having assassinated the usurper, i.e. Hephaestus, still doesn't manage to hold on to power in Mycenae, so he flees to Athens, where he is absolved of his crime by the assembly of citizens. And then he returns to Mycenae. Apollodorus tells all this, and then he returns to Mycenae and reigns in Mycenae. Now, it's hard to know exactly what's historical about this, but what's interesting is that it could be a legendary reading of an effort by Orestes to re-legitimize on a different basis from the one that was the equivalent of Agamemnon's Oath of Theodard, to re-legitimize his power in a different way after a period of civil war in Greece. So it would be a kind of formation that could be likened to what Augustus did when he established the empire. So it would be the overcoming of the aristocratic regime of the workshop kings I mentioned earlier, Achilles, etc., all the kings of the Iliad, and the replacement by a uniquely central power of the Wanaka of the Homeric Anaxi, Homeric Anthropone. Last stage, so Orestes leads his reign, so presumably he reigns over this Mycenaean empire, and his son Tisamen ascends the throne, but is said to have been overthrown by the return of the Heraclids. Archaeology, even if there are doubts about the reality of this invasion, its scale, etc., but in general, it is assimilated to the arrival of the populations of the Dorian migration from Illyria. Illyria, you know, is that region on the Adriatic opposite the Italian box. And therefore, in fact, the invasion of the Dorians, who were to become the population of classical Sparta, and who reached as far as Crete, meant that these Dorian invasions were the equivalent of the barbarian invasions of the Mycenaean Empire, since they destroyed the palaces and totally destroyed civilization, since the ruling ethnic group of a large part of Greece, apart from Athens, was protected. But if you look at Athens, which is well protected geographically, well, the heart of Athens civilization, i.e. the Peloponnese, and of Minoan civilization, i.e. Crete, which was now under Mycenaean control, were both invaded by the Dorians, the new ruling ethnic group in these regions throughout the classical war. And here too it fits in with the Meteoroics, since the generation of Tisamenes, which was overthrown by the return of the Heraclides, so these Dorians are in fact the last generation of Greek Meteoroics, after which there are no more. It's over. So if you like, this is what I could explain to you, i.e. how I think it's pretty clear from the way I explained it. For those of you who already know, since I explained them to you before, civilization A, civilization B, Minoan civilization is civilization A, Mycenaean civilization is civilization B, and so that's how it ends, and it ends in total collapse, which then gives way to this world, i.e. Egypt, which has survived, and the rest of the world, which is in total reconstruction, since there is no longer any central power, everything having been destroyed by the Mycenaeans, just as the fall of the Roman Empire left nothing like a vacuum, since it was the empire, the imperial power, that was important. The Middle Ages are the dark ages of Greek history, from the 11th century BC to the rebirth of Greek civilization, from about the 8th century BC, which I've already mentioned. So that's it for civilizations A and B, but we've still got more to see. So civilization E, I'm going to leave that out very quickly, but remember that civilization E in general is the one that borders on civilization A, which is a great rival of civilization B, which is of a similar culture but not quite, and which is generally the vassal of civilization D. Civilization D can't really be said to be the Hittites, even if it does fit in with the empire of the heart of the world, but I'll explain why. I think the role of civilization D in this first stage is shared between the Hittites on one side and Egypt on the other. The Hittites had the role of civilization D in the sense that they were the empire of the heart of the world on that side of Anatolia, and Troy was their vassal, so it's likely that civilization E was Troy, which wasn't really Hittite but was vassal of the Hittites, which was also, as we can see from the architecture, in the era of influence of the Minoan civilization, then dominated by the Mycenaeans, and having been a great rival of the Mycenaeans, so civilization E is easy to evacuate. It's Troy.